Princess Valeth Sorin stood at the observation window of her royal shuttle and watched the stars drift past like scattered diamonds against black velvet. She had been raised to understand duty and sacrifice from the moment she could walk and speak her people. The Etherians were tall and elegant beings with skin like polished silver and eyes that shifted colors with their emotions. They had been at war with the Korath hegemony for 300 years, and millions had died on both sides. Entire planets had been reduced to ash, and the screams of the dying echoed through generations now. There was finally a chance for peace, and Valeth was the price. The terms of the treaty were simple enough to understand. A marriage alliance would bind the Etherian dominion to humanity, the strange new species that had somehow convinced the Galactic Council to let them broker peace between ancient enemies. Valeth had spent weeks studying everything she could find about humans before agreeing to this arrangement. What she learned did not impress her. Humans were a young species that had only discovered faster than light travel 2 centuries ago. They possessed no natural telepathy like the Etherians, and no armored carapaces like the beetle-like Korthethi, had no venomous glands or enhanced senses, or any of the biological advantages that other species took for granted. They were soft and squishy, and they lived such short lives that an Etherian child would outlive 3 generations of them. Why the Galactic Council trusted these fragile creatures to enforce peace was a mystery that Valeth could not solve. Her father, the king, had tried to explain it to her before she left. The humans are more than they appear, he had said with a strange look in his ancient eyes. The council knows something about them that we do not, and perhaps it is better that way. Valeth had dismissed his words as the ramblings of a tired old ruler desperate for any path out of Warno. As her shuttle approached the human diplomatic vessel, she felt her heart beating faster with nervous anticipation. The ship was called the Endeavor, and it was unremarkable in every way. No elegant curves like Etherian vessels, and no brutal armor like Korath warships. Just a functional gray box floating in space with lights blinking along its hull. The docking procedure was smooth and efficient, and before Valeth could gather her thoughts, the airlock was cycling open. She stepped through, with her 2 attendants behind her, and found herself in a simple docking bay with white walls and bright lights. A small group of humans waited for her, and at their center stood the man she was supposed to marry. Commander Elias Vance was 34 Earth years old, according to his file. He had brown hair cut short and practical, and a face that seemed permanently caught between exhaustion and quiet amusement. He was not tall by Etherian standards, and his build was lean rather than imposing. There was nothing special about him at all. He bowed as she approached, and she recognized the gesture from her studies as a human sign of respect. "Princess Valeth," he said in a calm and measured voice. "I know this arrangement is not what either of us would have chosen for ourselves." He straightened and met her eyes without flinching. "But I give you my word that I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret agreeing to this." Valeth studied him for a long moment. His words were pretty enough, but she had heard pretty words from politicians and diplomats her entire life. Words meant nothing without action to back them up. What caught her attention were his eyes. They were brown and unremarkable like the rest of him, but they never stopped moving even as he spoke to her. Those eyes were cataloging the docking bay around them. She watched them flick to the exits, and then to the personnel standing nearby, and then to the shadows in the corners where threats might hide. Those were not the eyes of a diplomat. Those were the eyes of a soldier wearing borrowed clothes. "Your words are appreciated, Commander Vance," she said in her most formal tone. "I hope you understand that I agreed to this marriage for the sake of my people, and not for any personal affection." "I understand completely," he replied without any sign of offense. "That is exactly why I respect you, Princess." The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later aboard a neutral station near the border between Etherian and Korath space. It was a cold and political affair with no warmth or joy anywhere to be found. representatives from a dozen species watched as Valith and Elias exchanged vows. Written by diplomats and approved by committees, she wore the traditional silver gown of Etherian royalty, and he wore a formal human uniform with medals she did not recognize when the ceremony ended. They were husband and wife in the eyes of galactic law, two strangers bound together by duty and nothing more. Night they retired to their shared quarters aboard the Endeavor. Valith had prepared herself for the worst, because she had heard stories about human mating customs and their aggressive pursuit of physical intimacy. Instead, she found Elias pulling spare blankets from a storage compartment. "What are you doing?" she asked with confusion coloring her voice. "Making a bed on the floor," he said simply. "This marriage may be required by treaty, but that does not mean I have any right to expect anything from you that you are not ready to give." He arranged the blankets into a neat pile and lay down without another word. Vela stood there for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. Every assumption she had made about humans was crumbling, and she did not know what to think. "Commander Vance," she finally said. "Elias," he corrected gently from the floor. "We are married after all, and you should probably use my name." "Elias, then," she said slowly. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. "Because ending wars is more important than my personal happiness," he said at last. "And because maybe, if we try hard enough, this arrangement could become something more than just politics." Valith did not know how to respond to that. She climbed into the bed alone and stared at the ceiling for hours before sleep. Finally claimed her in the darkness below her. Elias Vance lay perfectly still with his eyes open and his mind running through threat assessments and contingency plans. The galaxy thought humans were harmless, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. But if anyone tried to hurt the woman sleeping above him, they would learn the truth in the worst possible way outside. The ship The Stars continued their eternal dance, and somewhere in the distance the Korath hegemony was already planning to break the peace they had just signed. War was coming again, whether anyone wanted it or not. And when it arrived, Elias Vance would be ready. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Valith found herself confused in ways she had never expected living with Elias. Vance was nothing like she had imagined it would be. He was kind in small ways that added up to something larger over time. He learned the proper way to prepare Etherian morning tea without being asked, and he memorized the names of all her attendants within the first week. He studied her language with dedication, and soon he could speak it well enough to make her laugh. With his terrible accent, when she woke from nightmares about the war, he was always there with a cup of tea and comfortable silence. He never pushed her to talk about what she had seen, and he never demanded explanations for her tears. He simply sat with her until the fear passed, and then returned to his blankets on the floor without a word. Somewhere along the way, Valith had stopped dreading his presence and started looking forward to it. But even as she grew fond of her strange human husband, she could not ignore the contradictions that surrounded him. The first thing she noticed was how other humans reacted to him. Diplomats and officers who visited the Endeavor treated him with a respect that went beyond his rank. They did not just salute him or defer to his authority, they looked at him with something ancient in their eyes. It took Valith several weeks to identify what she was seeing. It was fear dressed up as reverence. These humans were afraid of Elias Vance, and they were trying very hard to hide it. The second thing she noticed was the scars. Elias was modest about his body, and he always changed clothes in private. But there were moments when she caught glimpses of him, and what she saw made her silver skin crawl. His torso was a map of violence. Long lines that could only have come from blades crossed his back in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Circular marks on his shoulders looked like burns from plasma weapons. A jagged scar ran down his left side from his ribs to his hip. These were not the wounds of a diplomat who attended summits and signed treaties. These were the marks of someone who had spent years in combat. The third thing she noticed was the classified files Velith had her own intelligence officers, and she asked them to investigate her husband. She wanted to know who she had really married. What they found was almost nothing. Elias Vance had a service record that was 90% redacted. His early life was listed as classified under the highest human security protocols. His military assignments were blank pages with nothing but black bars where information should have been. The only thing her officers could confirm was that he had been selected for something called the Shadow Program at age 6. Everything after that was locked behind walls that even the best Aetherian hackers could not breach. When Velith asked her contacts in the Galactic Council about the Shadow Program, they suddenly became very quiet and very nervous. One of them told her to stop asking questions and then refused to speak with her again. The fourth thing she noticed was his nightmares. Elias never woke up screaming the way she sometimes did, but she learned to recognize the signs of his troubled sleep. His body would go rigid beneath his blankets, and his hands would twitch toward weapons that were not there. Sometimes he would whisper words in languages she did not recognize, and sometimes he would simply lie there with his jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding. In the mornings after these episodes, he would be quieter than usual, and his eyes would have a distant look that frightened her. One evening after a particularly difficult night, Velith decided to ask him directly. They were sitting together in the observation lounge, watching a nebula drift past the windows. "Elias," she said carefully, "what were you before you became a diplomat?" He did not answer immediately. His hands tightened on the armrests of his chair, and she watched his knuckles turn white. "I was whatever humanity needed me to be," he said at last. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed in a voice that sounded tired and old. "It is not." She could have pushed harder, but something in his expression stopped her. There was pain there that she recognized from her own reflection. Whatever secrets Elias carried, he had earned the right to keep them. He had been nothing but gentle with her, and that had to count for something. "Will you ever tell me the truth?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her, and for just a moment she saw something terrible behind his eyes. It was gone so quickly that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. "Maybe someday," he said, "when I figure out how to explain it without making you hate me." Velith reached out and took his hand in hers. It was the first time she had touched him willingly since their wedding. "I do not think I could hate you, Elias," she said. "You have been too kind for that." He looked down at their joined hands with an expression she could not read. "You might change your mind when you learn what I really am," he whispered before she could respond. An alarm began blaring. Throughout the ship, red lights flashed and a voice announced that all personnel should report to emergency stations immediately. Elias was on his feet in an instant, and the transformation was terrifying to witness. The gentle husband she had grown fond of disappeared, and something else took his place. His posture shifted, and his eyes went cold and calculating. Every movement became precise and economical, like a predator preparing to strike. "Stay here," he commanded in a voice that expected absolute obedience. "Lock the door and do not open it for anyone but me." Then he was gone before she could say a word. Velith sat alone in the observation lounge with her heart pounding and her mind racing. Who had she really married? What was Elias Vance hiding beneath his kind smiles and gentle words? The galaxy was about to answer those questions in the most violent way possible, and Velith would never look at humans the same way again. The emergency that night turned out to be a false alarm caused by a malfunctioning sensor array, but it planted a seed of fear in Velith that would not stop growing. 3 weeks later, that fear became reality. The peace summit on Nexus Station was supposed to be a celebration. Representatives from the Aetherian Dominion and the Korath hegemony would gather in neutral territory to sign the final documents that would officially end 3 centuries of war. There would be speeches and ceremonies, and the whole galaxy would watch as 2 ancient enemies finally laid down their weapons. Velith attended as the symbol of the new alliance between Etheria and humanity. Elias walked beside her in his formal uniform with that same gentle smile on his face. The grand hall of Nexus Station was filled with hundreds of diplomats and dignitaries from across. Lone space crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings, so high they disappeared into shadow tables laden with food from a dozen worlds lined the walls. Music played softly, and the air hummed with conversation and cautious optimism. Korath delegation arrived last. They were massive creatures that resembled beetles, standing upright on four thick legs. Their bodies were covered in natural armor that could deflect most small arms fire. Their mandibles clicked and clattered as they spoke in their harsh language. At their head was Regent Varth himself, the supreme military commander of the hegemony. He was larger than the others, and his carapace was scarred from decades of battle. Velith had studied his file, and she knew he had personally ordered the destruction of 3 Etherian colony worlds. Looking at him made her skin crawl with old hatred. The ceremony began smoothly enough. Speeches were given and documents were presented, and holographic recorders captured every moment for the Galactic News Network's. Velith stood beside her father, the king, as he prepared to sign the final treaty. Then everything went wrong. The Korath delegation moved as one. Weapons appeared from beneath their ceremonial robes, and the air filled with the whine of plasma. Rifles charging. Regent Varth raised one massive claw and pointed it directly at Velith. "Kill the Etherian princess," he bellowed in a voice that shook the chandeliers. "Let this be the spark that reignites our holy war." 30 Korath shock troops in full battle armor opened fire. Civilians screamed and dove for cover. Etherian guards tried to form a protective barrier on the royal family, but they were cut down in seconds. Plasma bolts scorched the air around Velith, and she felt the heat of near misses burning her silver skin. She watched her father take a shot to the shoulder and collapse. She saw her attendants fall one by one. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide to. 100 diplomats and civilians were trapped in a killing ground with no way out. Velith prepared herself to die. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother who had died in the war when Velith was just a child. At least they would be together again soon. Then she heard a sound that made no sense. It was the wet crack of breaking bone, followed by a gurgling scream that cut off abruptly. She opened her eyes and saw something impossible. Elias was moving, but the word moving did not capture what she was witnessing. Flowed through the chaos like water finding its path through stone. He existed between moments, occupying spaces that should have been impossible to reach. The first Korath soldier died before his weapon finished rising. Elias appeared beside him, and his hands moved in a blurred creature's neck, twisted at an angle that nature never intended, and it collapsed without a sound. The second and third Korath fell in the same heartbeat. Elias took a rifle from one of the falling bodies and began to fire. Every shot found its mark with surgical precision. He aimed for the gaps in Korath armor that should have been invisible from that distance. Eye slits and joint seams and throat vulnerabilities exploded in sprays of alien blood. 10 seconds had passed, and 15 Korath soldiers lay dead. Velith could not process what she was seeing. Elias moved through the enemy formation like a ghost made of violence. When they tried to surround him, he simply was not there anymore. When they fired at where he had been, he was already somewhere else. Korath, twice his size, swung a molecular blade that could cut through starship halls. Elias caught the creature's arm and redirected its momentum. He used the alien's own strength against it and drove the blade through its armored chest. 20 seconds had passed, and 23 Korath soldiers were dead. The survivors did something that Velith had never seen Korath do in 3 centuries of war. They ran hardened shock troops who had slaughtered millions of her people, turned and fled from this single human. They trampled each other, trying to reach the exits. They screamed in their clicking language about demons and monsters and death incarnate. Elias did not let them escape. He hunted them through the grand hall with patient efficiency. Every Fleeing soldier was cut down before they could reach safety. 30 seconds had passed, and 30 corpses littered the floor. Regent Vorath was the last one standing. The massive Karath leader swung wildly with his ceremonial blade, but Elias ducked beneath the attack. He drove his palm into the regent's throat with enough force to crush the windpipe of Arath. Fell to his knees, choking on his own blood. Elias stood over him without mercy or hesitation. "Your war ends here," he said in a voice as cold as the void between stars. Then he finished it. Grand Hall fell silent, except for the moaning of the wounded and the soft sounds of Vileth's racing hearts. Silas stood in the center of the carnage with alien blood dripping from his hands. He was breathing evenly, as if he had just taken a leisurely walk instead of killing 30 elite soldiers. The VI rifle in his hands was still warm. He turned to look at Veleth, and she saw his eyes. Those gentle, tired eyes she had grown fond of were gone. In their place were empty voids that held no humanity at all. They were the eyes of something that had carved away its own soul and learned to function without it. "Are you hurt?" he asked in a tone that expected an honest answer. Veleth tried to speak, but no words came out. She could only stare at the man she had married and wonder what else he was hiding. The galaxy would soon learn the answer, and nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of the massacre on Nexus Station was chaos and confusion news. Networks across the galaxy broadcast footage of the attack and the impossible response. Politicians screamed accusations at each other across diplomatic channels. The Korath hegemony claimed their delegation had been murdered. Without provocation, human diplomats worked frantically to contain the fallout before it spiraled into another war. Veleth ignored all of it. She locked herself in her quarters aboard the Endeavor and waited for Elias to return. When he finally came through the door, she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He had changed out of his blood-soaked uniform, and his face was clean, but she could still see the ghost of violence in the way he moved. "Tell me," she said before he could speak. "Tell me what you really are." Elias stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, and she saw pain break through the mask he always wore. He crossed the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from her. "You deserve the truth," he said quietly, "even if it makes you hate me." He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Humanity is young compared to most species in the galaxy," he said. "You were right about that when we first met. We are soft and fragile, and we live such short lives that other species barely notice our passing. When we first reached the stars, we had no idea what we were walking into. We thought the universe would welcome us with open arms. We were wrong." His voice grew heavier with each word. "The Velthari Compact found us before we had even developed proper FTL drives. They looked at humanity and saw easy prey. 3 of our colony worlds were conquered in a single week. 14 million humans were taken as slaves. They were worked to death in alien mines and factories. Their bodies were discarded like garbage when they were used up." Veleth felt her heart clench at the horror in his words. "We tried to fight back," Elias continued, "but we had no chance. The Velthari were stronger and faster, and their technology was centuries ahead of ours. Every battle was a slaughter. Every resistance cell was crushed. Humanity was facing extinction, and we all knew it." He stood up and walked to the window. The stars outside seemed very cold and very far away. "So we did what humans have always done when pushed to the edge," he said. "We adapted. We created something new, something terrible." He turned to face her, and his eyes were haunted. "The Shadow Program was humanity's answer to a universe that wanted us dead. We took children who showed certain aptitudes, and we trained them from the moment they could walk. We subjected them to psychological conditioning designed to strip away fear and hesitation. We enhanced their bodies with genetic modifications and cybernetic implants. We burned combat. algorithms directly into their nervous systems. We made weapons out of people. Valith felt cold spreading through her body. You were one of them. She whispered. I was selected at age 6, Elias confirmed. I do not remember my parents. I barely remember being a child at all. I remember training exercises and combat simulations and lessons in 100 different ways to kill. I remember my first real mission when I was 12 years old. I killed a Velthri officer who had tortured thousands of human prisoners. I did not feel anything when he died. By the time I was 20, I had personally ended 3 insurgencies against human territories. I assassinated 2 planetary governors who were planning attacks on Earth. I became very good at violence. His hands were trembling now, and Valith had never seen them shake before. The galaxy does not know what we are. He said, they look at humans and see soft, harmless creatures who are useful for negotiating treaties. They think we are too weak to be a real threat to anyone. That is exactly what we want them to believe. Because if they knew the truth. He paused and seemed to struggle with the next words. There are 400 of us. He finally said, 400 shadows scattered across human space. We have run the projections 1,000 times. If humanity ever faced true extinction, if we ever had to unleash all of us with no restrictions and no rules, we could functionally end all sentient life in the galaxy within a decade. The words hit Valith like a physical blow. She thought of the 30 soldiers Elias had killed in 30 seconds. She imagined 400 beings with that same terrible capability. She understood why the Galactic Council treated humans with such careful respect. We do not want that. Elias said quickly, God help us, we do not want that. That is why we broke her peace. That is why I married you. Every treaty I negotiate is a battle I do not have to fight. Every alliance is a species I do not have to destroy. I became a diplomat because I was tired of being a monster. His voice cracked on the last word. I understand if you hate me now. He said, I understand if you want to dissolve the marriage and go back to your people. I will ensure your safety no matter what you decide. You have my word on that. Valith sat in silence for a very long time. She thought about everything she had learned and everything she had seen. She thought about the gentleman who made her tea after nightmares. She thought about the killer who had moved through 30 soldiers like death itself. They were the same person. That was the truth she had to accept. Finally, she stood up and crossed the room to where Elias waited with defeat written across his face. She took his trembling hands in her silver ones. You were a child, she said softly. They took a child and made him into this. That was not your choice. That was not your fault. She lifted his chin and forced him to meet her eyes. And even after everything they did to you, even after they turned you into a weapon, you still chose to be kind to me. You slept on the floor without being asked. You learned my language and my customs. You made me laugh when I had forgotten how. Tears were running down his face now. I married a diplomat for peace. Valith said, I find that I am married to a monster instead. But the monster makes me tea when I have nightmares. The monster has never once raised his voice to me. The monster treats me with more kindness than most of my own people ever have. She reached up and wiped the tears from his cheeks. I think I would like to stay married, she said, if you will still have me. Elias stared at her like she had just performed a miracle. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. For the first time since she had known him, he let himself cry, and Valith held her monstrous husband and wondered what the future would bring. Outside the Endeavor, the galaxy was already changing the course. Hegemony was planning their revenge, and they had no idea what they were about to unleash. 3 weeks after the massacre on Nexus Station, they mobilized the largest military force seen in a generation. 40,000 troops loaded onto transport ships. A full invasion fleet of warships gathered at the border. Their target was the Etherean colony world of Varanthazid, was the planet where Valith had been born and spent her childhood. The message was clear to everyone watching. The Korath wanted to punish the Etherians for allying with humanity. They wanted to prove that no human could protect the people he had married into. They wanted war, and they were going to get it on their own terms. The Etherian Dominion scrambled to respond, but their military was exhausted from centuries of conflict. They could not get a defense force to Tharanthos. In time, millions of civilians were going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it then. Humanity made its move. The response was so simple that many observers thought it was a mistake. They sent Elias Vance alone warships and no support troops and no backup of any kind. Just one human in a small shuttle dropping toward a planet where 40,000 enemy soldiers waited. Velith watched the tactical displays from orbit. Aboard an Etherian observation vessel, she was surrounded by admirals and generals who thought they were witnessing a death sentence. The humans have gone insane. One admiral muttered, "They are sending one man against an entire army. Perhaps they are trying to make a symbolic gesture." Another suggested, "A sacrifice to show solidarity with our people." Valith said nothing. She remembered what Elias had told her about the Shadow program. She remembered watching him kill 30 elite soldiers in 30 seconds. She was not worried about her husband. She was worried about what the Korath were about to experience. Elias made planetfall 12 kilometers from the Korath forward operating base. He emerged from his shuttle wearing simple black combat clothing. He carried a rifle and a sidearm and nothing else. Then he started walking. The sun was just rising over the mountains when the first Korath patrol found him. 50 soldiers on a routine sweep of the perimeter spotted the lone human moving across open ground. They surrounded him with weapons drawn and mandibles clicking in amusement. A soft little human wandering into a war zone all by himself. They laughed at how easy this was going to be. None of them survived to report the contact. By noon, the Korath command structure was receiving fragmented distress signals from across their entire perimeter. Units that had been in communication suddenly went silent. Supply convoys detonated on roads that were supposed to be secure. Officers were found dead in bunkers that showed no sign of forced entry. One human. The panic reports repeated again and again. One human is doing this. High Command refused to believe it. They sent a full battalion of 500 soldiers to hunt down whatever force was attacking them. The battalion found Elias waiting for them in a valley between two ridges. He was sitting on a rock, cleaning his rifle when they arrived. They opened fire with everything they had: plasma bolts and explosive rounds and heavy weapons designed to destroy armored vehicles. The valley filled with smoke and fire and the roar of continuous weapons discharge. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, they moved forward to confirm the kill. They found only empty ground and spent shell casings. Elias had vanished. Then the screaming started. From the rear of the formation, he had circled around them during the barrage, and now he was inside their lines. The Botners battalion collapsed into chaos as soldiers fired at shadows and killed their own comrades. Elias moved through them like a virus through a body. Every shot he fired found a target. Every blade he drew tasted blood. When the last survivor fled into the wilderness, an hour later the valley floor was carpeted with Korath dead. By nightfall, 4,000 Korath soldiers were confirmed killed. Elias had captured their artillery network and turned their own weapons against their staging grounds. He had poisoned their water supplies and sabotaged their communication arrays. He had assassinated 17 officers, including 3 generals, and he was still out there somewhere in the darkness. The remaining 36,000 troops were in full panic. Soldiers refused to leave their bunkers. Sentries fired at every noise, and every shadow units reported contact with the human in locations hundreds of kilometers apart. He could not be everywhere at once, but they believed he could. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical violence. On the second day, the Korath High Commander made a decision that had never been made in the entire history of the hegemony. He ordered a full retreat. 40,000 soldiers fled from a single world because one human refused to let them stay. It was the greatest military humiliation the Korath had ever suffered, and it was broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. Within a week, the hegemony sued for peace, not the fragile ceasefire that had been broken at Nexus Station. This was unconditional surrender. They ceded territory and paid reparations that would cripple their economy for generations. They formally recognized Etherian sovereignty over all disputed systems. They agreed to human oversight of their military for the next 50 years. War that had lasted 3 centuries ended because of 2 days of violence from a single man. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy understood humans were not harmless. Humans were not weak. Humans were not prey. Humans had simply chosen to be gentle, and that choice could be revoked at any moment. 1 year later, Valeth stood on the balcony of their new home. On Etheria Prime, the silver mountains glowed gold in the setting sun, and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. Arms wrapped around her from behind, warm and gentle and familiar. The Korath ambassador sent another gift basket. Elias murmured against her hair. "I think he is still terrified. We will change our minds about the peace treaty. Let him be terrified." Valeth replied with a smile. "It is good for his health." Elias laughed, and it was a real laugh, one that came easier now than it had when they first met. The hollowness in his eyes had begun to fill with something else. Something she had put there through patience and love. "I never thanked you properly," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. For knowing what I really am and staying anyway." Valeth turned in his arms and cupped his face in her silver hands. "I married a human for peace," she said. "I stayed married to him for love." She kissed him. As the last light faded from the sky, somewhere out in the galaxy, diplomats were negotiating and armies were posturing and species were scheming for power. But here in this moment, a monster and his princes had found something rarer than peace. They had found each other, and they had found hope. The stars watched over them like ancient guardians, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. Humanity had shown what it could do when pushed to violence. Now it was time to show what it could build when given a chance. The future was uncertain, but it was no longer dark, because somewhere in the cosmos 400 shadows watched and waited, ready to protect the peace their brother had forged, ready to unleash hell if anyone dared to break it, and ready, perhaps, to find their own salvation in the arms of those brave enough to love them. The story of Elias and Valeth was just the beginning, but it was a good beginning, and sometimes that is all anyone needs.